You know, for most of us, ghosts are kind of reserved for scary movies or Halloween. But in Indonesia, no. There's something else entirely. They're woven right into the fabric of daily life, a constant, unseen presence that shapes culture, teaches lessons, and carries the heavy weight of history. So that's the big question we're tackling, right? Why is the supernatural just so normal in the world's largest archipelago? Well, let me tell you, the answer is way more complex and honestly, way more fascinating than you'd probably expect. All right, so let's just start with some numbers because this is pretty wild. A survey went out and asked Indonesians a really simple question. Have you ever seen or felt a spirit? Now get this, a whopping 56.5% said yes. I mean, think about that. We're not talking about some fringe belief here. For more than half the people they asked, ghosts are a real personal thing. So to really get why this is, we've got to rewind the clock, like way back. See, the modern belief in ghosts, it's all built on this incredibly old spiritual foundation. It all kicks off with something called animism. This is this ancient belief that pretty much the entire world is alive with spiritual energy. So it's not just people that have a soul. It's the trees, the rivers, the mountains, even the rocks. The natural world and the spiritual world, they weren't two different things at all. They were one and the same. But here's where it gets really interesting. When other major religions like Islam started to arrive, those old animist beliefs didn't just vanish. Nope, they fused. They blended together. So you have this ancient belief in local nature spirits mixing with concepts like the Islamic belief in jinn. What you end up with is this totally unique spiritual worldview where all these different supernatural beings kind of live side by side. And because of this blending of beliefs, the spirits that emerged weren't just, random spooky ghouls. In Indonesia, ghosts have jobs. Seriously. They became these key characters in a national drama, and each one has a very specific role and a story to tell. And wow, what a cast of characters it is. You've got the super famous Kuntilanak, the spirit of a woman who died in childbirth, a really powerful warning about how women are treated. Then there's the Wewe Gumbel, who snatches kids who aren't being looked after. Talk about a terrifying parenting lesson. And of course you have the Pokong, a soul trapped in its burial shroud, and the Tuyul, this little child ghost used to steal money. Every single one represents a specific fear or a moral lesson for society. So here's the key takeaway, right? These are not just campfire stories to scare people. They're actually powerful cultural tools. They're basically allegories that teach you what the community values and what it's afraid of. It's how complex social rules get passed down generation after generation. And believe me, these stories are not fading away. Not at all. I mean, just look at how modern media is keeping them alive and well. Comics at almost 81%, and movies just over 79%. These are massive drivers. They're constantly reimagining these ghosts, which means they're always part of the national conversation. Okay, but now we're gonna take a turn. Because if you dig a little deeper, these stories, they tell us something much more profound and frankly much more tragic about Indonesia's history. There's a real haunting truth hidden inside all this folklore. And to get to that truth, we can use a theory called cultural materialism. Now it sounds complex, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It says that a society's myths and stories, what they call the superstructure, don't just pop up out of thin air. They're actually built on the foundation of what's happening in the real world. The economy, the material conditions, that's the infrastructure. All right, so let's apply that. Let's ask, how did Indonesia end up with so many famous female ghosts? Well, the argument goes something like this. Step 1, you have a failing agricultural economy, which means widespread poverty and instability. Step 2, this pushes women out of their traditional roles and into really, really vulnerable situations. Step 3, this leads to systemic violence and oppression against women. And then step 4, and this is the kicker, all that unresolved trauma had to go somewhere. It found its voice in folklore. The ghost stories literally became the culture's memory of that suffering. So let's go back to those ghosts we met earlier and look at them with this new perspective. The Sunda Belong, she's not just a monster, she represents a prostitute who was raped and died pregnant. Simani Strembatan Ankal, the story of a woman murdered for refusing a forced marriage. And the Kuntilanak, the spirit of women who died during pregnancy because of violence. You see, they're not demons, they're victims. Their stories are basically memorials to real historical gender-based violence. I mean, it's an incredibly dark history. But it brings up a really important question. Is all of this trauma really just in the past? Or are the things that created these ghosts in the first place still happening today? Take a look at this number, 7,389. That's how many women died from pregnancy-related causes in Indonesia in 2021 alone. The exact danger that created the kuntilanak myth, women dying during pregnancy or childbirth, is still a modern-day tragedy. And what about this? 18.7%. That's the percentage of Indonesian women between 15 and 64 who experienced sexual violence in 2021. The very same kind of injustice that birthed the stories of the Sondo Belong, it's still happening. It continues to haunt the present. So, when you put it all together, the ancient stories, the hidden history, and the modern-day stats, you start to get a really powerful picture of what these ghosts actually represent. And here's the bottom line. The ghosts are still around because the societal injustices that created them in the first place, they haven't been fully resolved. These aren't just relics of the past. They're a living, breathing conversation about the ongoing fight for justice, for safety, and for equality. One source puts it perfectly. These stories serve as an exigent call for reconciliation. They're a constant reminder about the recurring oppression. In a way, they act as the conscience of the culture, making it impossible to ignore the suffering of the past and of the present. And that's really the ultimate purpose of these tales, isn't it? In a world where victims so often had no voice, where they were silenced, folklore gave them one that lasts forever. The ghost story is basically a promise, passed down from one generation to the next, that the silenced will never, ever be forgotten. Which brings us to one last thought to leave you with. Every single culture has its ghosts, right? Its myths, its monsters. And if the stories in Indonesia are a mirror reflecting its unresolved traumas and its deepest values, well, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What do our own ghost stories say about us?